You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome back to Engage, a Roddenberry podcast where we engage with you.
By the way,
I engage with John.
Can I say how funny? I heard from Bill from Trek Geeks, and he was like,
Mhm.
"Tell me about this Engage." And I'm like, "Well, here's what it is." And he goes, "That's so meta. It's a podcast about the feedback on the podcast." I'm like, "Yeah, but it works, and we're having a ball doing it." So, shout out to you, Bill.
Circular.
Yes,
like
yes,
that
completely.
before,
And then I
right?
said, and now we get comments on the comment show. So, yeah, go
It's
figure.
like the mystical figure Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail. It just
That's it. That is mission
just
log.
just create that outline in like mission log letters, and then
Yes.
the G
Yes.
gets eaten by the M, and so on
Right.
and so
Yeah.
forth.
Awesome. All right.
So what
Well,
do we
yeah.
have today, John?
All right. So this is what we do. We take your comments and emails and feedback, and we mull it over and we answer it in our unexpurgated way. So today I've got an email from David, and he says, "Hey, John and Norman. I got a chance to listen to Inter Arma Enim Silent Legis, and as usual, it was an excellent job. This podcast, though, continues a theme that has been resident in all of the time that you've been working on DS9, that of whether Starfleet has gotten dark and Trek has indeed dropped its principles. I watched DS9 entirely in its first run, have watched it several more times over the years, and watch along with your weekly episodes. And this theme has bothered me from the time I first saw it. I'm an original TOS and TNG fan and love the ideals that they represent. I strive to live that way myself and am genuinely hopeful we can move in that direction. With all of that said, I have found myself wondering how an evolved society that has eliminated hunger, prejudice, greed, and violence can keep itself going without those traits in a universe that is hostile around it. Relative to DS9 mainly, where we see just how nasty things can be, what would you do in the situation that if you don't strive to beat the enemy at all costs, everything that you have evolved to might just disappear? If Cisco hadn't been involved with the Romulans, the Federation would likely have fallen. If Ross hadn't worked with Section 31, millions would have probably died that have now been saved. Further, if there were no Section 31, hostile forces could very likely just to roll in and take over. So what do you do? Do you live by your evolved principles and face the fact that you're possibly an endangered species? Do you find a way to enforce your codes internally but externally focus on the survival of all you have accomplished? In Journey to Babel, Kirk questions whether Sarek can kill. Spock responds that a Vulcan, suitably motivated, is quite capable of killing. Suppose you assume that the Vulcan society is a mirror to the rest of Trek for this one incident. We know it changes when convenient. In that case, Spock's answer is essentially Inter Arma Enim Silent Legis, because there is no choice. David.
Hmm.
All right, Norman. So we have
Okay.
a what would you do from David here?
That's the interesting thing about this particular dynamic. We've talked about this at length, with when we first dealt with Section 31, and was it not Insurrection?
No,
What was the
no,
name of that
but yeah,
episode?
we know the
Yeah.
one. Yeah,
Yeah, right before in the pale moonlight, and
yeah.
and then
Sloane
then
shows up,
yeah,
and yeah, all right.
and then everyone is wearing black leather after that.
Yes.
So I think the real issue here is uh, deviating from the Star Trek brand. I've said this before. Creating this kind of drama in Star Trek, it creates this question. It creates kind of like this schism in the fan base where original series fans, next generation series fans, they are being delivered the message of Star Trek that has the particular Gene Roddenberry brand to it. Is there drama? Yes. Is there tension? Yes. But ultimately, all of the possible opportunities to avoid war, to avoid death, to avoid, this kind of, this war-like time that they have in Deep Space Nine, all of that is explored so that they try to avoid it at every possible turn. I think in Deep Space Nine, though, is that they're saying that why bother exploring it when you can just address it head on with might. There's a difference between the philosophy of trying to avoid the fight and the philosophy of knowing that you have the bigger guns so you can go in there and fight. but I think that with Deep Space Nine, like even like just remembering what I remember about the Dominion and when the Dominion was starting to move into the Gamma Quadrant to the Delta Quadrant, I was like, I don't really remember like a lot of episodes with ambassadors or diplomats trying to negotiate with the Dominion.
Hmm.
So where was that? Where were like all of the Federation peacekeeping opportunities to go into the Gamma Quadrant to actually talk to the founders and try and get their perspective, or at least try and talk to them and say, hey, you know what? We tried every possible avenue to avoid war,
Hmm.
but now we have to. So I never felt the Federation was actually up, their back was up against the wall. I think that there was a challenge, they accepted the challenge, and they decided to fight
Hmm.
as opposed to try and find any avenue of avoiding that. And like I said, I don't remember everything that led up to it, but I just don't remember a specific point where the Federation diplomats and ambassadors said, we tried everything. We have no other recourse but to go to war.
Right, right. I'm going to answer this a little bit differently and say, David, to the heart of your email here, what would you do? And I think about um, specifically in the Pale Moonlight and that confession from Cisco, and then erasing his words after it. What would I do? I might actually do the same thing. And I say that because, not because I think it's right, but because I think it's very human. And every motivation that led Cisco to that point is very understandable. And there are probably a lot of people who would do what he would do. And that's what part of what makes the drama of that episode so good and so relatable. However, here's the big however in all of this. Something that Star Trek has shown over and over and over again is that the principle is important. The principle is worth fighting for and worth living by. And when you violate that principle egregiously, there is going to be some consequence for it. We're all pulling for Kirk to go save Spock's body and finish that mission. But we also know that Kirk, even if he saves Earth on the way back from that long trip by picking up a couple of whales and going back in time, he will still face the consequences for what he did, which is stealing a ship and breaking out of space dock and disabling another ship and on down the road. So it's not that the actions are things that I think are so completely out of line. I understand the motivation to do what Cisco did. I understand the motivation that creates a thing like Section 31. What I don't understand is sort of Star Trek seemingly at times washing its hands of those things and just saying, like, well, they just happen because they happen. And not saying, we can actually do better than that. And I think about every episode of the original series where you have a Badmiral show up, or Next Gen, where you've got a Badmiral show up. And what happens at the end of the episode? The Badmiral is exposed for being the Badmiral.
Mhm.
And that person is no longer in a position of power, typically, by the end of it. Because we realized that was the problem that needed to be excised. That was the thing that needed to be dealt with, is there is a systemic problem. There was something that had worked its way up to the highest levels of Starfleet. And we can't possibly operate as an organization that has these standards and principles if it's rotten from the top. So, that's something that I hope that we get across in our episodes, is saying that no, we don't have this Pollyanna utopian view of the future where there is no conflict and everything is fine. Conflict exists and it will exist, and there will be threats and challenges no matter how good a society you've created. But if you throw out the principles every time a challenge comes along, why have the principles at all to begin with? Because it's
Mhm.
simply a way to say, well, we can just keep moving those back until it's convenient for us to accomplish what we want to do.
Exactly.
And I'm sorry, but for as many problems as we have in our modern world as of this recording, I would like to think that we can look at those, expose them, and then decide that we're going to do something better.
Mhm. Thank you, Dave, for that email. That was incredibly thought-provoking and well-written, and we appreciate that so much. So if you'd like to engage with us, just like Dave did, you can send your message to us here at youtube.com/roddenberryprod. You can also subscribe and engage with our playlist here in Mission Log Engage. So make sure you send your comments to us at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Mission Log Pod. And remember, we may engage with your comments on the air.